Hi, my name is Shelby Lawson, and I'm going to talk to you today about cooperative heterospecific eavesdropping on an anti-parasitic referential alarm call. So I study acoustic communication, which comes in a lot of facets for how sound is organized and how animals use it. Sounds might range from simple to structurally complex. They might be intrinsic to the animal, or they might be learned through social experiences. And they can range from being affective, conveying some kind of emotional state, to symbolic. And today's talk is going to be about symbolic communication, otherwise known as referential communication, which involves vocalizations that refer to specific objects in the environment, such as food sources or predators. And you might think this is just kind of unique to humans and human words, but it's actually across a wide range of animals, not even just those that are closely related to humans. Many birds and small mammals do this as well. And so there's also a more specific version of this called a functional reference call. And these involve vocalizations that refer not only to objects in the environment, but it also includes the fact that listeners of these calls respond with behavior specific to the object being referenced. So in the case of chickens, which are one of the first models for this type of phenomenon, they make calls that represent both flying predators and ground predators. And so other chickens, upon hearing this call for flying predator, will dash for cover, which is adaptive against flying predators. Meanwhile, conspecifics, they hear calls that mean ground predator, basically stand up really tall and scan the ground for the ground predator. So they're basically vocalizations that have a behavioral component that the listeners do once they hear them. And so because these signals can contain information that is useful for conspecifics, other heterospecifics might actually eavesdrop on these signals to use this information as well. And so in the case of the Diana monkey here, it has two different vocalizations, one for eagles and flying predators and one for ground predators, just like the chickens. And hornbills in this environment also listen in on these calls. What's interesting is that hornbills are depredated by eagles, and so when they hear the call for eagle, of course they get shocked and scan and run for cover, just like they would for any flying predator. But they're not depredated by leopards or ground predators. So when they hear the call for leopard, they don't do anything because the leopards aren't a threat to them. And so we have context-dependent behaviors here, depending on the threat posed by the referent. And so in a case like this, with many reference and eavesdroppers, we see that callers will have different reference here, and they make referential signals depending on what they see, and conspecifics hear those, and they do specific behaviors that are adaptive against whatever the predator is, so like hiding under cover or climbing up a tree. Eavesdroppers are similar in that they do context-dependent behaviors, but they take into account the relevance of the object being referenced. So here, hornbills would hide under cover against flying predators, but they'd show no response to leopards who don't threaten them. Let's talk now about the system that this study takes place in. So this is a yellow warbler, and it makes an anti-parasitic referential alarm call that denotes nearby cowbirds, which is this fella right here. So cowbirds, because they're brood parasites, they go look for host nests and lay their egg in them, leaving hosts to care for them and do all the work. This is quite costly, especially for yellow warblers. This is a huge energetic cost. And so yellow warblers have actually evolved a seet call, which is a referential call for cowbirds, and they use it to warn nearby conspecifics of the cowbird in the area. I'm going to play that seet call for you now. And so these seet calls are referential in that they're produced almost exclusively towards cowbirds, especially towards female cowbirds. And this is known by a series of model studies from the past, as well as some playback studies that I have done, including data that's right here, where you can see that seet calls for both male and female warblers are only produced in the context of cowbird chatter and seets. So upon hearing a cowbird or upon hearing other seet calls, those are pretty much the only instances you're going to see yellow warblers make the seet call in response to. Furthermore, seet calls are functional in that when yellow warblers hear them, the females rush back to their nests and sit on them to prevent cowbirds from looking in them and laying an egg. So it's a behavior that's linked to the seet call. In our study, when we presented seet calls, 90% of females actually returned to the nest within a few minutes of hearing the seet calls. We also have a study that's in review right now where we looked at the effects of this the next day. So if you play seat calls versus chips or silence the day before, what happens the next morning when cowbirds would come back to lay an egg if they were there. And so we saw that females who heard seat calls the day before actually got off their nests less often and for not as long the next morning. So keep an eye out for this one. Reference seat calling is also affected by the risk of brood parasitism. So seat calls are mainly produced during laying and incubation when the cowbirds have to lay their egg to time with the rest of the clutch. And if they don't lay by that point, they're pretty much too late. So we see seat calls during incubation and laying. We don't really see them during nestling stage and beyond. Our recent work with males that either had a nest investment within a partner versus not having any kind of mate or nest found that if they do have an investment, they of course seat. But if they are single and don't have any kind of nest investment, they don't seat at all in response to cowbirds, and they don't seat that much in response to seats compared to paired males. So it really is that seats are affected by risk of brood parasitism both before and during nesting. And so, considering that over 200 species are parasitized by yellow warblers, many of these live within the area of yellow warblers. A lot I'm showing here our ater field sites are really close to yellow warblers and can hear them. We do wonder if any could use the seat call as a part of their own frontline defense against brood parasitism themselves. So the question is, do any heterospecific species eavesdrop on yellow warbler seat calls? And yes, spoiler, red-winged blackbirds do, because I showed you that on the title slide. But let's back up a little. So this was found through a series of my experiments where I was presenting seat calls to yellow warblers, and then red-winged blackbird males just kept showing up to these seat call playbacks and making alarm calls. And so we analyzed the data to see if there was any pattern to this, and lo and behold, during cowbird and seat call playbacks, these guys came in about 50% of the time an alarm called, and this was a much higher rate than to these other threat signaling playbacks, such as alarm calls, nest predator, or control. And so when you think about it, red-winged blackbirds actually are a pretty good candidate for a bird to eavesdrop on yellow warblers to be able to evolve this ability. For one, they just live close by pretty often, so they would be able to hear the seat call. For another, males of the species act as sentries for their territories. They're polygynous, they have a lot of female nests on their territories, and they don't help with childcare and they don't help with building, for the most part, at least for the childcare. So they're pretty much set up in a role where they just pay attention to what's going on around them, and they would be primed to hear these alarm calls and learn what they mean. Lastly, red-winged blackbirds already have a sophisticated enemy recognition system that we know from past studies. So studies that have used models of brood parasites or nest predators or conspecific intruders know they can tell the difference between these. And if you present models during incubation versus nestling stage, what we see is that red-winged blackbirds are really aggressive to cowbirds during incubation stage, pretty aggressive to nest predators as well. During this stage. However, if you wait till nestling stage and test them again, you'll find that they're not really responsive to brood parasites because the risk has decreased by this point, whereas they're really responsive to nest predators as the investment in their young increases. And so building upon this paradigm, we could basically throw seat calls into the mix in a playback study and see how these birds respond to these different threats, assuming that if they could understand what seat call means, based on our preliminary work, that we get similar responses to that versus brood parasites. And so lastly, the last little key bit here is that yellow warblers already benefit from nesting near red-winged blackbirds. They experience less parasitism in their nests when they nest near aggressive red-winged blackbirds. So it's possible this could be a mutual relationship where red-winged blackbirds also benefit nesting near yellows because they get access to the alarm call system for brood parasites. And so our predictions for this experiment: if red-winged blackbirds eavesdrop on seat calls as a frontline defense against brood parasitism, we expect seat calls should elicit similar urgency to respond as other threat signaling calls. Aggressive responses should be most similar towards cowbird and seat calls and different than other signals for danger. That's important. And responses to cowbird and seat calls should change based on risk of brood parasitism, similar to how we see them respond to models of cowbirds, where it should be high during incubation and low aggression during nestling stage. And so for our methods here, we tested red-winged blackbird and female pairs during incubation and nestling stage. We presented one of 4 playbacks seek calls, cowbird chatter, blue jay calls, and wood thrush song. It's important to note that both cowbird chatter and seek calls again signal brood parasitism, but the key here is you can only understand the signals brood parasitism if you understand the yellow warbler. Speakers were placed 5 meters from nests, and playbacks lasted 10 minutes with a minimum of 2 observers watching for behaviors. And we tested the focal male and focal female twice. And I specify focal female because, again, these kites are polygynous. They have multiple females in their territory. So we only watched the nest owner female for these experiments. During nestling stage, we also recorded whether the male had any other nests of eggs in the territory, because by this stage there's a pretty big staggering of the stages, and so sometimes males would have nestlings and eggs on their territory, which could matter for behavior. And for this experiment, we measured a couple things. I'm going to focus on alarm calling behavior today, but we also measured latency, which I'll show you quickly, and we also measured closest approach, but I'm not going to talk about that today because of time. We analyzed these using general linear models with the different treatments and dates and trial order as fixed effects, and we tested sexes and age nest stages separately. So here's a video for what a playback might look like. The playback speaker is here in green, kind of hidden in a shrub. It's playing cowbird chatter, and the rubbing blackbird male is approaching an alarm calling at it. And so let's jump to results for alarm calling. First, I'll show you incubation, the nestlings data, and then both so you can get an idea of the pattern. To orient you to this graph, these lines here are the mean, and then the box represents a plus and minus standard error. And the letters denote significance within the post hoc tests. And so males we found called at similar rates to seets and cowbirds and blue jays during incubation, and these were all more than the control. So they were highly aggressive to all 3 of these playbacks, which is a good sign. Seet was being treated with a lot of aggression, and it was very similar to that of cowbird chatter. If we jump to nestling stage, we can see that though all the playbacks are still being alarm called at it, the blue jay call is getting most of the alarm call responses, whereas alarm calling to cowbird chatter and seet is essentially the same as the control by this point, so they're not really getting as much attention as the nest predator call during this stage. So what does this mean when you add it all together? It means that males only produce alarm calls in high amounts towards cowbird chatter and seet calls, compared to the other treatments at least, when cowbird parasitism is a threat. So they're only responding pretty strongly during incubation stage to any cowbird signaling calls, in comparison to nestling stage when this response generally drops. I want to point out that this side of the graph only includes males that had nestling nests, because of that presence of eggs factor ended up being significant, where we found that males that had eggs in their territory still responded really strongly to cowbird chatter and warbler seeds. So clearly there's this understanding that if you still have a nest of eggs in your territory, you're still at risk of brood parasitism, and so they still responded very strongly to these cowbird signaling calls compared to when they didn't have any eggs at all and had no risk. Also, we did a correlation study during incubation stage where they were really responsive to seet and cowbird, and we found that they were actually even more responsive to seet and cowbird if they nested closer to yellow warblers. So when they were privy to the information of seet calls, it's almost like it primed them to be more aggressive to these 2 calls when they nested closer to yellow warblers. Let's also look at females here for alarm calling. So females have the same exact patterns as males do. They don't alarm call as much, but they still alarm call quite a bit. So cowbird chatter, warbler, seet, and blue jay compared to the control during incubation stage. During nestling stage, we see that they're still alarm calling some to these, but they're comparable to the control now, and now the blue jay is the one that's getting all the alarm calling, not so much the cowbird signaling calls or the control. So we find the same conclusion when we take it all together. Females produce more alarm calls towards cowbird and seet calls compared to other treatments when cowbird parasitism is a threat. Once cowbirds aren't a threat anymore, they don't respond as much to chatter and seet anymore. Let's look at latency really quickly here. It's the same pattern we see for alarm calling, but it's kind of inversed here, where they respond quite quickly to cowbird chatter, seet, and blue jay calls, whereas they're essentially ignoring wood thrush song. during incubation stage at least. During nestling stage, we see that they're pretty much slowly expanding or ignoring cowbird chatter and seet and wood thrush song, and are responding much more quickly to the blue jay at this point. So they're only responding quickly to cowbird and seet calls when cowbird parasitism is a threat. If I go to the female graph, the pattern looks the same. They tend to wait a little bit longer to respond, but again, we see really quick responses to these threat signals during incubation, only strong responses to blue jay during nestling stage. So let's summarize real quick here. Seek calls should be responded to with similar urgency as other threat signaling calls. We did find that to be true with our latency data. Aggressive responses should be most similar towards cowbird chatter and seek calls. We also found that to be true. During incubation stage, though, it was the same as blue jay calls. So there really wasn't a way to tease them apart at this stage. However, during nestling stage, we were able to tease them apart, and we found that responses to cowbird chatter and seek calls did change based on risk of brood parasitism, where it was high during incubation but low during nestling. Check. And this is similar, again, to model studies from the past, where we find really high aggression to predators during nestling stage, low aggression to brood parasites during nestling stage as well. And I'm going to point out we did a meta-analysis recently on this as well across multiple species, so you should check it out if you're interested for more. So, big takeaway, rubbing blackbirds eavesdrop on seek calls and treat them as a signal for brood parasitic danger. And furthermore from this, you could see that rubbing blackbirds and yellow warblers do appear to have a mutualistic relationship, where rubbing blackbirds are the muscle and yellow warblers are the warning system. And the significance is that this is a powerful example of an adaptive behavior in the context of anti-parasitic referential alarm calling and eavesdropping, a good system and one of its kind here. And so here's my acknowledgments of my funding sources. Check me out on Twitter if you want to see some more, or check out the lab on Twitter. Everyone who was really helpful going out in the field with me and helping me out with the papers, and I just appreciate it all. And so you can check me out on Twitter and ask me a question there if you like, because you're watching the recorded talk. But otherwise, I hope you enjoy it and have a good day.